Good morning. My name is Sarah Emons, and it is both an honor and a pleasure to welcome you to the 26th Southwold Remembers service. Today, we gather as friends, neighbors, and fellow citizens, united in remembrance. I extend a heartfelt welcome to the members of the Southwold community, distinguished guests from neighboring municipalities, representatives of the Legions and Veterans Associations, and the dedicated cadet groups joining us this morning. Your presence here speaks to the strength of our shared commitment to honor those who served, to remember those we've lost, and to ensure that the legacy lives on. We'd like to begin our assembly this morning by honoring the memory of two cherished contributors to Southwold Remembers who have died in 2025. Perry Clutterbuck passed away June 30th, 2025, in his 89th year. As a young boy, Perry Clutterbuck watched in awe as aircraft from RCAF Station Fingal No. 4 Bombing and Gunnery School soared daily over his family's farm, a short 2.5 kilometers south of the facility. In 1993, as chairman of the Kettle Creek Conservation Authority, Perry initiated a project to erect a plaque on the site recognizing the former airbase and commemorating the 19 airmen who died in tragic training accidents. As a direct result of this initiative, with support from the Veteran Affairs Canada's Commemorative Partnership Program, many local organizations have erected plaques and memorials across Canada to recognize RCAF bases and personnel active in World War II. Perry has initiated this project, and he indicated that this was one of the most proud accomplishments of his time in public service. Perry Clutterbuck dedicated 18 years to serving his community on Southwold Municipal Council, including 9 years concurrently on Elgin County Council. Over the course of his public service, he held the roles of councillor, deputy mayor, and mayor, serving as mayor for 6 years. In 1998, Perry was honored to serve as the warden of Elgin County. In September 2000, under Perry's leadership, Southwold Council approved a request from local volunteers to initiate the Southwold Remembrance Day services. Just weeks later, on November 12, 2000, Mayor Clutterbuck laid the first Southwold wreath, and at the inaugural service, a gesture that marked the beginning of a cherished tradition. Many longtime attendees of Southwold Remember will fondly recall Perry standing at the front door of the Keystone Complex, warmly greeting guests as they arrived, a quiet but powerful symbol of his commitment to community and to remembrance. Perry and his wife Mary were founding members of the Southwold War Veterans Memorial Committee. Their leadership helped to anchor the memorial site project in both legacy and purpose. In June 2022, Perry and Mary were honored for their commitment to community service. They both received the Queen Elizabeth II Platinum Jubilee Award from MP Karen Vecchio. We extend our deepest condolences to Mary and the entire Clutterbuck family, and we thank them for sharing Perry with the Southwold community for so many meaningful years. Today, we also honor the life of another remarkable man, Ronald Arthur Jewell, a veteran, a legionnaire, and our longtime parade marshal. Ron answered the call to serve his country, and he did so with distinction for 28 years, serving with the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada and the Royal Canadian Regiment. Ron served tours in Korea, Germany, and Cyprus. After his retirement in 1980, he became a member of the Royal Canadian Legion, and through his volunteering efforts with the Legion, he received a life membership in 2004. Ron became our Southwold Remembers Parade Marshal in 2004. He brought precision and reverence to every ceremony. He made sure that each step, each salute, each moment of silence carried the weight that it deserved. He understood that honoring our fallen was not a performance, it was a duty. Ron had great pride in his Korean War service and enjoyed getting together with fellow Korean veterans, as he did at our gathering in 2010. In 2021, due to COVID restrictions, we held a scaled-down virtual Southwold Remembers service, and Ted Barris presented his book, Deadlock in Korea, Canadians at War, 1950 to 1953. Ron and his wife, Marianne, were in Seoul, South Korea, to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the start of the Korean War. But the Jewels watched the entire virtual production and emailed back their appreciation. Looking good, Ron and I watched the service from our room in Seoul, South Korea. It was very touching that Ron and Mary Ann would have such loyalty to Southwold Remembers. Or maybe Ron was checking in to see that Legion 41 Sergeant-at-Arms Will Alden was up to the task of filling in for him that day. We will miss seeing Ron Jewell taking his customary place behind Piper Bill McMaster and leading the Royal Canadian Legion 41 Color Guard through the pergola and out to the memorial site, marching with purpose, bearing the regimental drill cane, a symbol of precision, pride, and ceremonial authority. Ron Jewell was the epitome of what Canadians expect of our military. So today, we salute Ronald Arthur Jewell. We thank him for his service, his leadership, and his example. Our condolences go out to his family. In June 2022, Ron Jewell and Perry Clutterbuck stood shoulder to shoulder, proudly captured in a group photo as each received the Queen Elizabeth II Platinum Jubilee Award, testaments to a life of service. Please rise and join us in a moment of silence as we pay final respects to Perry Clutterbuck and Ron Jewell. You may take your seats again, and I'd like to welcome Reverend John Brown.
Good morning, folks. You have in your hand the bulletin, and on the back you will find the printed prayer, and it is responsive. So let us share it as indicated. Let us pray together. God, we bow our heads and come to you with both prayers of thanks and requests for your continued guidance. We acknowledge the vast number of families and friends who have felt the loss of loved ones who went to war and never returned home.
For those families, the memories of their loved ones' contribution to the war effort is now a part of family history.
We think today of the rejoicing and relief which family members experienced when their son, husband, father, relative, or friend returned home from the wars.
We have multiple reasons to pause and express gratitude for veterans who returned from war and contributed so much to the life of their families and communities.
God, with the passing of the years, as these veterans have died, you have offered comfort to their families coping with sorrow. Even as we remember past years, we seek your guidance, O God, as we continue on life's journey.
New wars begin, and years of conflict and civil wars continue.
Our Heavenly Father, we offer our prayers that the peace accord between Israel and Hamas, between Arabs and Jews, may come to a successful conclusion. God, our creator and sustainer, in a world where you want peace amongst your people,
we are challenged to live in a way that provides for peace in our homes and communities.
O God, may we put our faith in the future you have planned for us as we live out the values of peace, justice, and harmony within our families and our communities. Amen. Please join me in welcoming Reverend Diane Macpherson with a special tribute.
Each November, we gather here at the Southwold Keystone Complex to honor the brave men and women of Southwold who served our country and our community during a time of war. We also choose a Silver Cross family to represent one of these fallen heroes, ensuring their memory lives on in our hearts and in our history. Canada officially recognizes August 15th, 1945, Victory over Japan Day, VJ Day, as the end of the Second World War. The majority of Canadian service members were back on home soil within 3 to 6 months of the war's end. While 66 did not return, we are deeply grateful that many Southwold veterans did come home, and when they did, they quietly got to work rebuilding the community they loved. Please take a close look at the cover of your printed program. The photograph on the front of your program today shows a group of Shedden area veterans. One woman and 25 young men of the Shedden community were guests at a reception held in Shedden on June 28, 1946, for returning service personnel. These are Southwold veterans who returned home after World War II. They were ordinary Southwold residents who had done extraordinary things. And when the war ended, they didn't seek recognition. They rolled up their sleeves and helped shape the Southwold we know today. Men like Lawrence Silcox, who joined his father's building supply business in Shedden. Lawrence was a steady hand at a number of part-time jobs, whether doing janitorial work at the Shedden CIBC Bank, assisting the undertaker at the private funeral home, or as a butcher at the cold storage locker. He and his wife, May, also raised 4 children in Shedden. Clarence Palmer returned to help runs Palmer's Red and White grocery store with his brother Ralph. Clarence won to earn an award for excellence in an advertising campaign. He volunteered at the Shedden ballpark booth in the summers. Clarence provided quiet leadership at the Shedden United Church. His wife Dorothy gave piano lessons to neighborhood children, enriching lives with music and care. Their 2 daughters were part of the fabric of the Shedden community and SS Number 9 public school. Many of the community will remember Clarence with his signature red bow tie at the Red and White store. Ted Silcox owned and operated Silcox Fuels in St. Thomas, but his heart was in Shedden. He coached and sponsored local softball teams, and his sons Doug and Don carried on that sporting legacy. His wife Effie was a leader in the Women's Institute and the Rebecca Lodge, organizing events, supporting families, and strengthening the bonds of community. Richard Stafford and Archie Tiny Tietzel returned to their farm, sustaining Southwold's agricultural backbone. Many others of this group also farmed in Southwold. Gordon Houghton, with his wife Elma, raised their sons on a farm west of Shedden. Gordon and Elma were active in the Shedden Baptist Church. Hundreds of grade 5 students throughout Southwold received New Testament Bibles from Gordon. Elma taught in Southwold's rural schools and at Southwold Public School, shaping young minds with patience and grace. Betty Ann Carter is the only woman pictured in the Welcome Home photo. In a ceremony at Shedden in 1950, Betty Ann married Douglas Wagner, a Royal Canadian Navy veteran. Like a few Southwold veterans, Betty Ann and Douglas eventually moved away from Southwold, enriching their new communities. The Wagners raised 2 sons and a daughter, living first in St. Thomas, then for a decade in Burlington, where Betty worked in the meat and produce section of the Dominion store. Betty also inspired others as a Weight Watcher instructor and speaker. The Wagners eventually relocated to a home on Ross Street in St. Thomas, enjoying many happy years there. Betty passed away in 1990 and rests in Shedden Cemetery. War veterans in many other communities around Southwold shared this same experience. These veterans and their families didn't just come home. They came back with purpose. They built businesses, coached ball teams, taught children, and served in churches and service clubs. They turned sacrifice into renewal, and their legacy lives on, not just in our memories, but in the very heart of this community. So today, as we honor those who served and those we lost, let us also remember those who came home and quietly made Southwold stronger, kinder, and more connected. Former Timmins, Ontario MP Charlie Angus recently made this statement on his podcast. Canadian veterans came home to build our nation after World War II. And that's exactly how it happened in Southwold.
It is my privilege to introduce today's keynote speaker, Ted Barris. Although he really needs no introduction here in Southwold. Ted is an acclaimed author, journalist, and broadcaster whose work has brought Canada's military history vividly to life. Through more than 20 books, Ted has shared the stories of ordinary Canadians who performed extraordinary acts of courage and service. His deep research and compelling storytelling have earned him national recognition. In 2022, he was appointed a member of the Order of Canada. But more than accolades, Ted brings heart, ensuring that the voices of the veterans and their families are heard, remembered, and honored. By an unofficial count, today marks the 19th time Ted Barris has appeared as our keynote speaker. Southwold Remembers considers him an institution. Please join me in welcoming Ted Barris.
Clearly, I don't have a life. Thank you so much, Sarah. What lovely words. You know, we take for granted the quality of the presentations that John and Sarah and Diane have just given us. They spend hours thinking about the appropriate things to say, the same way I do when I'm writing my books, and I really respect that dedication. And we deserve to thank you for all the work you do and the thought you put into your presentations. Thank you. But if I may, I want to pick up on something that came from all of your words. John said in the prayer together, talked about the pause in gratitude to veterans. Sarah talked about the wonderful things that Ron and Perry did for this community, making sure we didn't forget. I remember talking to Perry 25, 30 years ago, more than that, because of his love of Fingal. When I was doing my book on the BCATP, when he heard about it, he said, "I got stuff for you." And it was great. And Ron, because I did a book on Korea, tough nut to crack. But then I stumble on Diane's words. Not that they're ill-chosen. They're very respectful. But you notice she said it twice. They quietly got to work rebuilding their communities, turned sacrifice into renewal. Quietly sticks in my craw. Not out of disrespect for what Diane said or what the veterans go through, but I've always stood at Remembrance Days ceremonies and wondered, silence is the last thing I want from these men and women. I want them to share with me what they did so that I can understand who they were, what they did, and what their comrades did. So way back when, I started thinking about breaking the silence, making sure that I found a way somehow to get to the heart of the stories that changed us, changed the world, changed them. So what I'm going to do today is share with you a few of the stories that emerged in that search and in that attempt to gently, respectfully break the silence of their service. Okay, is that fair? Am I stepping on toes? Okay. See, she's already passing the buck. Okay, all right. I'm going to start to talk about somebody most of you know. Many years ago, I decided I was going to do a short documentary on the wonderful people at the Canadian Harvard Aircraft Association. I had no idea what it was. So I went down, I live up in Uxbridge, so I hit the road and I drove to Tillsonburg, and I found these Harvards flying in the sky, and hundreds of people scattered across the airfield, and I had no idea what I was into or in for. So I went looking for the CHA group, and I arrived there, and there's a guy wandering through the audience saying, "Loonies for toonies, loonies for toonies," and I approached him and I said, "Who are you?" He said, "I'm Charlie Fox." And I said, "What do you need the loonies for?" He said, "Well, the coffee machine's broken down. We haven't got enough loonies. I need some more." And I gave him some loonies, and I said, "What's your connection to all this?" He said, "Oh, I used to fly these birds during the war." And I said, "Can I get a couple of minutes from you?" He said, "Sure." About 4 hours later, we began an incredible conversation going through, distant from the news piece I was doing, into his pilot's log. And any of you have seen, how many of you are pilots in the audience? A few of you. The most precious thing in your accounting of life is your pilot's log, I'm sure. It's a treasure. And let me point out as an aside, don't ever, ever let them out of your possession. They are worth gold, literally. Anyway, Charlie's was like that, and we went, look at the calligraphy on this page. I know it's a little bit far from the back, but it's absolutely letter perfect. And I was just in awe. And so I sat down several times with him, not just on that occasion, but many times going over the flight log. And from that conversation that day began a 20-year friendship. He became like my second dad. So I delved into his career. I wanted to find out as much as I could about him. And he sat down with me a number of times. And in this clip, this isn't my clip, but I was able to retrieve this. I think Terry Scott got this, who's with CHA. And this is a thought from Charlie about why veterans acquiesce, give in to the silence of not describing what they experienced. Listen to this, watch this. Suck it all in, it's really important.
When I came home from overseas, I went back into retailing, and Mrs. Howden came into the store. Andy Howden and I had met in grade 4, elementary, all the way through high school. I joined the Air Force. I didn't know that he joined the Air Force until I'm in Bournemouth, and I meet Sandy Borland and I knew Sandy was in, and he was a fighter pilot, had joined 416 Squadron. I had joined 412 shortly before. And we met in the main street, and he said, "Guess what, Charlie? Andy Howden and Howie Steen are in having lunch in the officers' mess. I'll go and get them, we'll have a picture taken." So in front of the Royal Bath in Bournemouth, there's 4 fellas from Guelph, Ontario. Andy Howden, Howie Steen, Charlie Fox, and Sandy Borland. 2 came back and 2 didn't. Mrs. Howden came into the store. I went back into retailing in Guelph, Walker Stores. She started crying, came up to me and grabbed me by the shoulders, started shaking me. This would be probably January 1946, just shortly after I came back, and saying, "Why my Andy and not you?" and started pounding me on the chest. "Why my Andy and not you?" And all I could do was hold her and say, "Mrs. Howden, I don't know why not me." And for that reason, I didn't talk about things for 40 years. My brother Ted never talked about it. And this is a lot of veterans don't talk. Some are talking now, but don't talk because they felt guilty.
They felt guilty that they had survived. I think it's a very Canadian thing that they sense that. They don't want to. The Brits and the Americans very often wave the flag and are proud of their accomplishments, and rightly so. Canadians tend to be more respectful of the remembrance and loss and don't want to appear to be standing on the bodies of their dead comrades. But let me review for you a little bit of Charlie's career. Charlie saw one of these, a Hawker Hart, flying over his home in 1934 and knew immediately he wanted to fly, and if possible, in a military aircraft. And of course, when the war came along, he joined up right away. and figured that he was going to enlist, as he did. And there he is, second from the right, left, sorry, in the back. And he joined up in 1940 at age 20. Remember what you were doing at age 20? Some of you aren't there yet, but most of us have been there. Could we do anything of any consequence at 20? Rarely, if we could. Anyway, he joins. Oh yeah, by the way, one of the things that Perry told me, and others, when Fingal was up and running in Jarvis and Dunnville, the young men who were here doing essential service during the war felt rather threatened by all these tall, handsome, beautifully uniformed, coiffed young men from the Air Force, because they were afraid, the young men in town, that their girlfriends would fall for these guys, right? Yeah. Now, I have to be very respectful about the way I say this, but there's no two ways about it. A rumor was then circulated by the young men. I don't know who came up with it. When you see these young men, they told their girlfriends, look at the flash in the cap that they're wearing. They told their girlfriends, if you see a guy walking down the street with a white flash in his cap, it means he's got syphilis. It worked for a while. Anyway, Charlie moved on, and he became a leading aircraftsman, which is the entry level, and then he eventually went through elementary flying training school, and he got his wings. That pair of wings on his chest is like the Holy Grail. That's what you were striving for. And when he got there, he thought for sure, they're going to send me off to England, and I'm going to become an ace. I'm going to knock down all those German aircraft and win the war single-handedly. Well, he graduated so high in the class, they made him an instructor in the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. And he instructed at Dunnville, number 6 Service Flying Training School, from 1941 to 1943, craving every day he flew with a student, hundreds of them, to get the heck over there to do the thing that he wanted in the first place. There's Dunnville from the air then. It was one of the busiest airfields in this part of the world. And you know how many schools there were across Canada in BCATP? 231. People think, oh yeah, it was Dunnville and Trenton and Borden and Comox. Yeah, but about 250, 225 others. It's just amazing what the plan was. Anyway, I don't think he even recognized what he was in, but he did later. And so in the Harvards, in the classroom that he had for the students, there's the Harvard in the air, he probably trained 100 pilots or thereabouts, and he accumulated about 1,500 hours of flying time training others in that time. Now, that doesn't seem like a lot maybe by today's standards, but when I compare with what the airmen who were actually flying in combat flew in a number of hours, in a minute you'll get the recognition. There are all the young men who are admiring an instructor. The instructor was like, you'll pardon the expression, God for these guys, because the instructor determined your fate. And eventually, Charlie, there he is, fourth from the left, with 412 Squadron overseas. He finally gets there in Spitfires in 1944. He's posted to Biggin Hill and Tangmere, which are the stations that were famous during the Battle of Britain and beyond. And he had to earn his keep there. And he said to me, you weren't accepted as a fighter squadron or into it until you'd proven yourself. As a former BCATP instructor, I had 1,500 hours in the air, way above everybody else, while some combat pilots had flown fewer than 200 hours. I began as tail end Charlie. Here's the painting that's famous with that. He's there in the back. He flew with Buzz Bierling, his squadron leader, initially, and then paid his dues and worked his way up the ladder. He did 223 combat operations. Notice I didn't say missions, that's American. In Canada, we say operations. He wasn't with a scalpel, but boy, some of his online firing was scalpel-like. And he downed or damaged 5 enemy aircraft and was famous for busting locomotives and vehicles. He got 2 DFCs. And then he came home to Andy Howden's mother, who shook him in the store, pounded on his chest, and said, why you and why not my Andy? Now, that's not exactly like losing your buddy in a trench somewhere or blown to pieces, but boy, it's just as devastating. And it was to Charlie, and he put everything away until I came knocking all those years later. There he is, his honorary colonel. And I went back to that flight log, and we went through it page by page. And I suddenly noticed in the flight log, on July the 17th, this is my line in there now on my piece of paper. It wasn't lined in his flight log. There's a little red tick at the end of the line. And I kept pestering Charlie. What the heck does that little tick mark? You know from your flight log, you put nothing in the flight log that's not aerobatic or aeronautical. When you took off, where you went, what your registration numbers were, if you're instructing who your student was, that's it. No, flowery words or additional stuff, just the basics. Anyway, so I was really stumbling with that entry that had the little tick next to it. And I finally got him to tell me. And here's the essence of that July 17th, 1944 tick in the margin.
Our squadron flew 2 sorties that day, one in the afternoon, and the second one took off at 6:15 in the evening. As soon as we got airborne, we broke up into 3 sections of 4, looking for targets of opportunity. And I spot this staff car coming down this highway or road with trees on either side. I watched, and as the car approached an opening, I timed it to come down. My number 2 slid under, and he's off to one side, and we came down, and I strafed it down the left side, and it veered off and went into sort of the ditch. Later on, the report was that Rommel had been badly injured, and he was in the hospital. And then after the war and so on, and people that did some investigation said, well, this took place, according to the Germans, between, I think it was 5:30 or 5:25 and 5:40 or 5:45. We took off at 6:15. And so I got a letter about that where they said I wasn't in there at the right time. Fine. That would be 1992. And I never wanted to make anything of it. That's fine. And then with research, this is where we were on double daylight time. The Germans were on, and Europe was on single daylight time. So I was in the air at the right time and so on. So it's been authenticated that I was in the right place at the right time and put Rommel in the hospital.
Put Rommel in the hospital. He put Rommel out of the war, because it was later discovered that Rommel was implicated in the assassination attempt against Hitler. So they told him to commit suicide or we'll do it for you. He put him out of the war. I didn't find out until all those years later, and then we got a number of people. Here's the painting again, thanks to Lance Russburn. It's a fabulous painting, and it captures the moment perfectly. But what was incredible was we had to prove that Charlie's calculations and those with the double daylight saving and all that was accurate, and we ultimately eventually did, and he got the credit. Thanks to the guy there, Michael Levine. He's the guy that did most of the legwork. I joined him, and we essentially made sure that Charlie's success that day was logged as taking the Desert Fox out of the war. Now, if Charlie had been an American, they would have made a Hollywood movie out of him, right? There he is, one of his last posing in front of. He became the torchbearer in spite of Andy Howden's loss and his mother. Now, what strikes me is, again, this is not a painful thing in losing a limb or losing a pal or the destruction of your base or your aircraft or all of the losses that happened in Bomber Command, 10,000 Canadians lost. This is an emotional connection to the fact that he survived. Guilt. That's PTSD, if ever I saw it. All right. I want to tell you about a lady who used to live next door to me. Her name was Rodine Doris Mary Buckley Beavers Egan. I knew her as Ronnie. Look at that picture. She's 90, and she got the Elizabeth Award. Anyway, after I got to know her in this house, I was allowed to go inside, and I spotted in the front foyer this photograph. Could you fall in love with that? You bet. She was, anyway, I said, what's that? She said, I was in the Wrens during the war. I said, yeah, I can see that. And she began to tell me her story. But I began to put 2 and 2 together that she was trained in Guelph, went to Halifax at Stadacona. Any Navy people here? Stadacona is a stone frigate. It's where you trained. And she was there as a petty officer in charge of the Wren's barracks. I said, Ronnie, that means you were there during the riots in Halifax at the end of the war, May 7th and 8th, 1945. She said, a bunch of nonsense. She also, sorry, I'm getting to that in a second, she also took great pride in the fact that she led the parades, because as a petty officer, she had that authority. But the joy she had, most of all, not just leading the women through the parade marches, but leading the men and putting them through their paces. Kind of revenge for people who said, what are you doing here in the Navy, ma'am? Anyway, as I said, there she is a little later on. I deduced that she had been in Halifax. Some of you may be familiar with the famous riots. This is when, Halifax during the war had about 40,000 residents and 60,000 servicemen and women in it. And all the service people had advantages that the civilians didn't. They could get food, and they were getting 3 square meals and pay, and the people who were running the cafes and shops in Halifax didn't get that. And they hated each other, and when they saw the Navy people, not entirely, but often, when they saw the Navy people coming down Barrington Street in Halifax, some of the shop owners threw signs in the windows, no dogs or Navy people allowed. They hated them that much in those circumstances because they were deprived. Anyway, when the end of the war is clearly happening, and the barracks had to shut down because they didn't have enough beer and booze to celebrate, they got open gangway. The Navy was allowed to go ashore. And then riots. Look at the film in the upper left-hand corner here. So I said, were you there during the riots? And she said, a bunch of nonsense, as only a woman who's gone through this would say. A bunch of nonsense. And watch this film. This film was taken on May 7th and 8th, in the destruction of the city downtown. People died, businesses were destroyed, thousands of windows broken, streetcars derailed and burned because everybody went crazy looking for a place to celebrate, and the mayor told everybody in town to lock everything up, and of course everybody broke into the Keith Brewery and all over the place, and people were running around downtown with booty and stolen goods, and then claiming later that they actually just happened to arrive in their backyards or whatever. Here's the tally. At the end of the 2 days of rioting, 55,000 Navy personnel in Halifax were running around the city, and all the businesses who closed out of fear were ransacked. There's a shoe store, ransacked. Look at the guy carrying all the stuff down the street. Obviously a service guy. And civilians were doing the same thing. It wasn't just Navy, it was Air Force. Here's the end result. 564 businesses destroyed, windows destroyed, $5 million in property losses, and Ronnie kept saying to me as I repeated these numbers to her, a bunch of nonsense. She was angry, furious, upset that the careers of the people who had served in Halifax were smudged by this horrible event at the end of the war. And then she explained all this to me, that she had to duty at the end of the day on those 2 days, as she had throughout her stay there, to make sure that the Wrens were safe in the barracks. But because she was married, she'd married a guy named Willis Egan, again, my neighbor, they had matrimonial apartment off the base. So at the end of the day's duties at Stadacona, she walked down Barrington Street amid the rioters. Suddenly, she came across the Zeller's store in the background there, and she and a Wren friend of hers went into the store to get some toiletries, whatever, and they were on their way out. And in the doorway on their way out is a guy with a torch, drunker than a skunk. And he clearly wanted to bust past her and torch the place. And Ronnie said, standing in the doorway, look at that face, look at that face. She could do this. And what the heck do you think you're going to do? Oh, we're going to torch this place. She said, oh, no, you're not. And there was the Texas standoff. And I guess the sailor figured, there's better pickings down the street than this, I'll go somewhere else. And I said, Ronnie, you mean you saved the Zeller's store? She said, a bunch of nonsense. Now, I'll get back to that in a minute. Some years later, adding to the insult, at least in my mind, she was at home with her daughter, and I was living next door. And I often went, she took care of my dog when I went into the city to work or whatever. And one day she said, can you come over? I got an enclosure from Veterans Affairs, and I wonder if you can help decipher it for me. And I sat at the table. It's about 1995 or something. And it was an application for benefits. I said, Ronnie, what's this? She said, oh, I want to approach the Veterans Affairs to see if they can rake my leaves in the fall or shovel the walk. I said, Ronnie, you've been entitled to this since 1945. You served your country. You survived the Halifax riot. Bunch of nonsense, she said. But she said to me, why would I expect money from the Canadian public, from the government? I came back with Willis. He had a job. We had a family. Everything was fine. Why would I ask for anything more? Well, you deserved it because you were in uniform and you stepped up, put your life on hold, served your country, and for raking leaves and shoveling walks, and by the way, a ramp to her house. I called the MP, who happened to be at the time, the Minister of Veterans Affairs, Aaron O'Toole. I said, Aaron, get your guys up here tomorrow and build a ramp for this woman pronto. He did. Not because of me, but he recognized there had been this horrible gap in our paying attention. And it wasn't PTSD, but it was certainly a misgiving about what she was owed and whether she was deserving of it. Okay? All right, this guy is interesting. Korean War veteran. This is a photograph from Korea. And I pay my respects to the Korean War veterans here today. I'm so glad they're here. Hal Merrithew, I met him at an event in Eastern Ontario when they were rechristening a monument, or not a monument, a cenotaph at Elmont. They were actually, they had recently carved into one side of the cenotaph, adding names to it, because we had forgotten the Korean War veterans and the war dead. We were catching up, and the ceremony was making sure that the Korean War dead were also embodied in that monument. So there was an event that day, and then I met Hal at a little gathering afterwards. He didn't have his jacket on, so I didn't see his medals. But I asked if he would be interested in having a conversation. So the procession, or the proceedings, went to Carleton Place, just up the road, to do the same thing later that day. And then there was a reception, and down by the river, there was, just away from the reception hall, was this bench. So I invited Hal to come down to the bench, and he was wearing his jacket. He had a military cross among his medals. And I asked him about the award, and he began to cry. And I stopped. I said, painful remembrance? Not what you think, he said. When he collected himself, he began to tell me about his experience in Korea. And again, I don't have to go over this too lengthy, but the war began in 1950 in June, and the Canadian ground contingent consisted of the RCR, the PPCLI, and the Royal 22nd, who rotated through the line. See where the 38th parallel is? That's roughly where the main battles were. I mean, the main incursion was when the North Koreans came across the 38th parallel into south. That triggered the United Nations signatories, including Canada and 47 other nations, to go and defend South Korea. Then in the winter of 1950, with the Americans' help, they pushed all the way to the Chinese border. That brought the Chinese Communist Army into it, and they pushed them all back down to the 38th parallel, and that's essentially where the war remained for the next 2 years, until the armistice in 1953. Now, the rotation through the front lines was really interesting, and Hal described this to me. He'd actually been a veteran of the Second World War, so he had experience in the Royal 22nd, and when the Korean War happened, he signed up again. And he became an instructor as well, and a platoon commander. So he told me about how they would rotate in and out of the line, and you probably know this. When you would go into the line, imagine that front line, it's occupied by about 8 or 10 different nations. And each of the regiments would go into the line for a certain period of time. It might be weeks or months, and then rotate out. They protected themselves along the 38th parallel with minefields that they sowed. You sow the mines in the ground. So when Hal got there, I think he was with PPCLI, and the RCR had just completed their stay. So when they left, the Royal Regiment of Canada, the Royal Canadian Regiment, I should say, sorry, went out into the minefield that they had sown, pulled all their mines out, left, and PPCLI came in, and the pioneers put their mines in. Okay? Now, why would you do that? Well, so that the frontline Canadian soldiers would know where the mines are. Sounds kind of obvious, but also rather dangerous, wouldn't you think? You're fooling around with mines, and this part of the world is probably the most mined portion of the world, with maybe the one exception of Bosnia. In any case, that was the routine. And so Matthew would sow the mines, mark the maps so that they knew where they were, and he did a really interesting thing that I had not expected in 1950 or 51, whatever it was. He assessed the personality characteristics of his men. 1950. He's just a guy from Quebec. What he wants to do is to make sure that the attitudes, the personalities, the sense of urgency, and the sense of caution were there in his men. And so he looked for men who had bravado, stepped up gladly, loudly, and those who took a second thought, absorbed the order, responded, but thought about it, and maybe if encouraged and invited, offered suggestions. So you had the calm, cool, quiet ones, and the louder, more outspoken, step up and let's get it done ones. And he did this with all the men in his platoon as the process of going into and out of the line was going on. And so, suddenly, there's an emergency. On October the 8th, 1952, that no man's land out in front of the mines, where both the United Nations forces went out looking to capture Chinese Communist Army prisoners and vice versa, went on in that no man's land. Suddenly in the night, the mines out in front of the Canadian field, the ones that they'd set, begin exploding. And they think there's an assault coming. The Chinese and the North Koreans are plowing through this. And if any of you have read anything about Korea, they came by the thousands into those lines. No, that wasn't it. They suddenly get a radio report. A Canadian platoon coming back from no man's land has accidentally stumbled into the Canadian minefield and set off the mines. Which means the only way they're going to be removed is to turn the job over to the people who know where the mines are located. And so he chose two people. A guy named Pierce, who was quiet, thoughtful, a little older than the other guy, Dion, who was full of bravado, eager to serve, ready, and he took those two guys out into the minefield. And it was as hard on the ground as this floor is, because it was October and it was frozen. They took a metal detector into the dark, mind you, to see if they could make their way to the mines, and they could hear moaning out in the darkness. They got to find who's ever there. And the three of them go out. And they search, and they search, and they search using bayonet. Oh yeah, that's right. The metal detector, when they turned it on, just went wherever they were, because there's metal everywhere. So they're down on their hands and knees with bayonets crawling through the dark to the locations of the mines. And there they are, the three of them, for 90 minutes, bringing out those who had been killed. I think it was 2 who died and 3 who were wounded. And Hal said to me in that moment, in the dark, we couldn't see anything. We stopped. We could hear moaning of the wounded. I talked my 2 corporals through the entire rescue in whispers, because the Chinese are out there. And in 90 minutes, they brought out 3 men alive and the 2 bodies. And so when I said to Hal, that's what you got your military cross for? He said, yeah, there's the picture. And Dion and Pierce got military medals for their actions that night. And I asked him to recall the night, and he broke down again. And I said to him, what was it that's upset you? He said, that was the last time I ever saw those guys. I tried to find Roland Pierce in Sudbury, where he lived. I phoned every Pierce in the phone book, but I couldn't find him. I gave up. The man had not been given time for closure. We hear that word a lot. What does it mean? It means that he couldn't get together with the 2 guys who'd saved 3 lives, brought back 2 bodies, come through it together to share the experience and say, look what we did, and we survived, we did our duty, and somehow the chemistry of who we are as combatants paid off. I said goodbye to Hal after a very respectful conclusion to the interview, never expecting to see him again. 1 week later, I traveled to Brampton, where coincidentally, on July the 27th, the Wall of Remembrance was being unveiled. Big ceremony with about 500 or 600 veterans from all over the country, Korean War veterans. This is in Brampton. And after the ceremony, I went into the big reception hall. And I'm walking through the reception hall, and everybody's wearing, same as your green blazer, with nameplates on. And I walked by, and there was a guy, Pierce. I said, Pierce? He was sort of jolted by my reaction. I said, yes. Roland Pierce? Yes. PPCL? Yes. Korean War? Yeah. Remember your commanding lieutenant? Hal Marathew? He said, yeah. He said, do you remember? He said, yeah. He said, I loved Hal. He was the only guy who allowed me to speak English in the regiment. Do you know he's been looking for you for 60 years? Really? So I got them together, and they had a reunion for the first time in 60 years to allow the closure he'd never been given at the time. Now that may sound small, it's not colossal, it's not earth-shattering, but to that man, being able to close the loop was such an important part of his service. And the suffering he went through not to have that closure was as powerful as losing his best friend. That's the nature of post-traumatic stress in certain circumstances. Okay, I have one more story to tell you. Oh yeah, they also reunited, not just at a gathering that was informal, but at the Congress in the year 2000 in Ottawa. It was great to see them. I was emceeing the event, and so they were there. It was great to see them together. This is video from a trial that occurred in 2002. You will remember, some of you, that on April the 17th, 2002, members of the Canadian Army were training at a place called Tarnack Farm. And on that particular night, in their training exercise, they were overshot by 2 jets, Americans. One of the pilots in the jet mistook the action on the ground for an attack against them and fired a laser-guided 500-pound bomb and killed 4 Canadians. Here's video shown at their trial, the 2 pilots, the court-martial.
The U.S. military today released several minutes of video and audio from the cockpit.
So they saw some flashing on the ground, so they turned their aircraft towards the flashing and flew over to investigate what it was.
Request permission to lay down some 20 mic. Stand by.
Let's just make sure that it's not friendly, that's all.
Copy 5-1, boss man, hold fire, I need details. Okay, I've got some men on a road, and it looks like a piece of artillery firing at us. I am rolling in self-defense.
Boss man copies. McMaster arm, laser arm.
What he was actually looking at was the backblast of my Carl Gustaf. His crosshairs were on me, on my weapon system, and that's when he just hit the button.
Bombs away, cranking left. Shack. Boss man.
Copy 5-1. Boss man, disengage. Friendlies can't hunt. I hope that was the right thing to do. Yeah, me too.
Friendly's Kandahar. It wasn't the right thing to do, and 4 men died. And the papers carried it right away, and we lost these 4 soldiers in that attack, in a training exercise. Now, when word of this loss comes to a small community, I don't have to tell you people about that because we've heard from our esteemed friends from the offering some recognition of loss. In a small community, it really is powerful. In mine, in Uxbridge, we have a long history of connection to the First World War with our statue of Sam Sharp. It's a whole other story. But we suddenly discovered that 2 men who had connections to Uxbridge were at that place at that time. It took a while to find out that they were alive, but I tracked down these 2 men and a medic to get the stories of what had happened. Now, let me just add quickly that most of the veterans whom we've all known, the ones from the Second World War and even the Korean War, it's been so long that they have, in a way, established a bit of a patter when they're asked a question. So that if I were to ask a Korean veteran where he served, he would think of the words that come readily to him because he said them before again and again as a way of maybe deflecting my next questions. It's a shield. The younger veterans haven't been at this long enough to do that, so that their experiences are more raw, they're closer to the surface, in a way, not to cast aspersions on any veteran, a little more honest, because they're reflecting exactly what happened, unexpectedly dealing with the stress on their hearts and their minds. So let me just tell you a little bit about these two guys. DeCare came from Manitoba, enlisted in '97. He wanted to become a search and rescue technician, but they said you got to go through the regular military channels, do service and deployment before you can go there. So he ends up on one of those Gustav rocket launchers or whatever the heck they were. The same, that's it there. And he's with Brett Perry, the guy who was quoted in that last passage. In other words, he was just meters from where the bomb hit. And in fact, there it is there. You can see a little bit of tape in the middle of the picture. That's where the bomb hit. That's the top of a drainage ditch, which actually saved lives. If the bomb had hit the flat of the desert, the shrapnel would have gone horizontally and killed more men. But because it hit the edge of the ditch on an angle, it went up into the air and straight down. Now, the guys here were killed, the four of them. Brian was over here. Now, Brian came to me to interview. I interviewed him at my home. And I won't go on too long, but I want to share with you a couple of moments from it. I told everybody in the house, everybody's out of the house tonight, my daughters, my wife. I said, I want the house empty except for Brian and myself. He came to the door, and it was like a deer in the headlights. He was scared. He thought I was looking for dirt and was going to hang him and nail him to the wall with all my questioning. He came in. I said, relax, Brian, I'm not looking for that. And he had a briefcase with him. And I sat him down at the kitchen table, put my tape recorder in front so he knew that I was taping it, and he splayed a bunch of pages on the kitchen table. And I looked closely, and I realized they were handwritten responses to the questions he knew were coming. So that when I asked a question, he'd grab a piece of paper, you know, where did you grow up? Oh, I grew up in Manitoba, and then I enlisted in such. Next question. Gave him the question, picks up a piece of paper, reads it. My job was to find a question for which there wasn't a written answer on the page, on the table. And about an hour into the interview, I got to it. I asked him, when the bomb hit, Brian, what did it sound like? And he looked around the table and he realized the answer wasn't there. And he said, you're going to laugh. I said, try me. And he pounded his hand into his other hand, and he said, you know that Roadrunner cartoon with the Roadrunner bird and the Wile E. Coyote, and the anvil comes crashing down onto the Wile E. Coyote, and he slammed his hand again. He said, it was just like that, and he laughed, and I didn't. And the door opened, and he gave me all the details I needed about what really happened there. And then occasionally he asked me to stop the tape recorder, and I respected that. And we went through the entire thing. All along, he kept saying to me, I don't like reporters because they get things wrong and it pisses me off. I said, that's fine, and you're right. Sometimes we get it wrong, but if we pay attention and listen, sometimes we get it right. And so I spent that time with him, getting as much as I could. This guy was the medic on the scene, Bill Wilson. Some of you may have come across him, and I'll explain why in a few minutes. Anyway, he also, here's a little background, he was born in Ontario. He was older than the others. He was also deployed in Somalia, Rwanda, and then to Afghanistan, so he had lots of experience. And he loved deployment. Look what he said. He said, it was the lifestyle to me, like giddy up, I'm ready. Deployments are why I joined the military. Not that he had the bloodlust. He just wanted to show his superiors, his peers, his comrades, that the training that had been invested in him, he could deliver. And I met him in Borden. He had all this experience behind him, and he was still studying for more tests to upgrade his skill as a medic. He gave me the medic interview that I couldn't get from my dad, who was a medic in the Second World War. He was brilliant. Anyway, he's here at the ambulance in the top. That wadi is the ditch there and the arrow of the direction of the bomb strike. And when it hits that night, he was the senior medic. And he said to himself, I'm halfway down the wadi. I'm thinking, medically, I'm in charge. triage became my first responsibility. His job was to find the living and keep them there, and to deal with the bodies of those who weren't. And he was amazing. At one point I said to him, how in the heck did you see in the dark? Because after the bomb exploded and the flames went down, it's dark out there in the desert. He said, oh, we had those bands for around our heads and a light like doctors and dentists do. I said, great, was it Army issue? He said, no, my mom sent them from Home Hardware in Canada. But this guy was so keen and so clearly dedicated, he was rewarded for his skill, and I realized that the power of training sometimes surmounts the post-traumatic stress. This is the last guy, Jeff Peck. He went to school with my daughters in Uxbridge. There he is in front of a platoon. Some background on him. Born in Ontario, went to RMC, and he was a platoon commander, and he was waiting to do the exercise that Brian had just gone through. So his turn was next to go in the line when the bomb hit. And he talked about what it was like to fight in Afghanistan. And this is interesting because Canadians had a very different perspective than Americans did. Not surprisingly, we have different tactics and different thought processes. He said, on a mountain mission, we were told anyone there is an enemy. In a town, different rules of engagement were there. You just don't know who's friend and foe. Americans tended to go in and force, shoot, and ask questions later. The Canadians were told, among those people you see are friendlies. You've got to know who they are. And so that was his attitude about all of his service. He was in this truck, an Iltis truck, which was adjacent again to the strike. And when it hit, he didn't know what it was. He thought it was an attack. And he immediately called for a head count, making sure the members of his platoon were all together and everyone was okay, and then deployed them to secure the perimeters. They had glow sticks to go out into the dark to mark where the wounded were and where the bodies were and the parts. It's just, this is what he went through. He said, I'd like to say the tour affected me for the best, but I'd be lying. It was hard on my family. This young man admitted to me in several interviews that it was tough coming back. And again, because it was so close to the surface and he hadn't a script to read to me, it was tougher for him to go through. And he relented. I mean, he gave me what I wanted and more. When the Canadians pulled out of Afghanistan, you know what he said to me when it was all over after 12 years and we were essentially abandoning the Afghan situation completely, and then the Taliban came back in and it was all their territory again and all the things that had been done were undone. I said, what did you think about that? He said, you know, Ted, someday it's going to pay off. We planted a seed among the women. And I don't mean that in a horrible sense. I mean that in the sense of their knowledge and their sense of freedom and their sense of education, the sense of what life could be. He said that seed will one day grow. That's the power of overcoming post-traumatic stress. But there's one more story associated with Jeff. Jeff went on to go into JAG, the legal side, but before I get to that, a couple of years after he'd gone over, one of his pals was killed, Matthew Dawes. And he volunteered to be there on the tarmac at Trenton when Matthew Dawes' body came home. He was the attending officer to work with the families. And the family was, as you can imagine, distraught. And then, of course, the families would get into the limousine adjacent to the hearse, and the entourage would pass from Trenton to Toronto, about 60, 70 miles, whatever, 100 miles it is, and pass along what became the Highway of Heroes. And he would sit with the family. He sat with the family on the way down. And he saw this. And he talked about what it was like. He said, nothing could have prepared me for the Highway of Heroes experience. Shocked at the show of support I was, grief shared by the fellow Canadians on those bridges. Inside the limo, the Dawes family was cheering and laughing and crying and remembering. It was like a roller coaster because they would be weeping and grieving logically, obviously, the loss of Matthew. But then they saw these people, strangers, celebrating their son, acknowledging his sacrifice, waving flags in silence, some cheering, motorcycle groups, the firefighters, the paramedics. I went to about 4 or 5 of those and stood in awe, not just of what I was seeing pass onto the bridge, but what was happening on it. And then he went on to say to me ultimately, It was then in the limousine with the family that I was allowed to grieve. Among them, he was allowed to realize that seeing Matthew Dawes' box, the box could have held him. He later, as I said, went on to become a judge advocate general, lawyer, and has been decorated a number of times. Brian went north into the Arctic in search and rescue and has been twice decorated. And Bill became, after his experience in Afghanistan, he retired, and he was one of the leaders in the intensive care unit in Windsor when the hospital there needed the kind of experience he had overseas in Afghanistan applied to COVID and dealing with the triage and the importance of dealing with civilian medicine after military medicine. So, post-traumatic stress isn't as obvious as you think. That's what I've learned. Breaking the silence is sometimes painful. It breaks the rules of remembrance and peace and quiet and all those things that you talked about at the beginning when we respectfully give them silence to remember in time and space. And I wait till that's over, and then I start asking questions. It's my job. It's what I do. And I thank you so much for your attention.
Ted, every year we are graced to hear you speak and to tell these stories, but I don't know if anyone else feels this way, but this was maybe the most powerful talk you've given. I really thank you for delivering stories that we don't hear enough about. We don't talk enough about, and sharing some of those experiences with us. So on behalf of all of us, thank you again for our 19th gathering, attending this and making this gathering unforgettable. We have already saved a seat for you at our 20th Southwold Remembers. It just wouldn't be the same without you. Thank you, Ted. So now I ask that if you are able to stand again and join our vocalist, Leah Morise, as we sing God Save the King.
God save our gracious King, long live our noble King. God save the King. Send him victorious, happy and glorious, long to reign over us. God save the King.
We may all sit down, take a couple minutes. Great. Okay, so everyone may sit down. We will not be, having an outdoor ceremony today due to the weather. Unfortunately, the Harvards needed to cancel, and I think we all would have been pretty chilly out there. So we're going to continue on with the second half of our program, indoors.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Mike Vecchio, and it's my honor to welcome you to Southwold's 26th Remembrance Day service. It's a time for us to come together as a community to honor those who have served and reflect on the sacrifices made. As Sarah mentioned, due to the snowfall coming down, unfortunately we won't have the Harvard 2 flyovers today, so we're going to keep everything inside and keep everybody warm. I'm joined today by Reverend John Brown and Reverend Diane Macpherson, and our parade marshal is Will Alden. Thank you all for being here.
As we begin this portion of the memorial site, let us begin with prayer. Let us pray. O Lord our God, in this place of memory, we offer our words of prayer. Today we are acutely aware of the fact that our freedom did not come lightly. And certainly that is true with what Ted has shared with us. For so many people around the world in the midst of present conflicts, for the people fighting discrimination and oppression, they long for the freedom that is ours. For the veterans who have died, and those presently serving in our armed forces, we pause to say to them, thank you, thank you. Help us to teach our children and grandchildren how much we are in debt to those who have defended us in the past and those who still presently serve, to the end that we may live in freedom. Help us to make Canada worthy of their dedication and sacrifice. God, bless our troops, and may God bless our country. And let's everybody say amen. Amen. Amen.
Please bow your heads as we remember those members of our community who have fallen in service for their country, and to acknowledge the courage of those who still serve. Assisting with the presentation of wreaths this morning are the Royal Canadian Legion Branch 41 Color Guard, number 7 Royal Canadian Army Cadet Corps, number 2884 Engineers Army Cadet Corps, and number 741 Elgin Royal Canadian Air Cadet Squadron.
Order, color. Stand at ease.
Captain Roy Edward Dubber was a Canadian pilot who served with the Royal Air Force during World War I. He was born on March 31st, 1899 in St. Thomas, Ontario. Roy was the son of Thomas and Cynthia Dubber of Middlemarch, Southwold. Possibly having a career in mind, Roy attended the St. Thomas Business School. Captain Dubber flew with the number 107 Squadron RAF, which operated the Airco DH-9, a single-engine de Havilland biplane bomber used extensively during the war. On July 18, 1918, Captain Dubber and his British observer, Lieutenant Cecil Baron Dickey, were reported missing during a bombing raid. Their mission was part of the Second Battle of the Marne that took place near Cheilly, France, during the German Spring Offensive. Both men were later presumed dead and are commemorated on the Arras Flying Service Memorial in Pas-de-Calais, France, which honors airmen with no known grave. However, a 2020 investigative report suggests that their remains may lie in Dormant French National Cemetery, in graves originally marked for unknown British aviators. Captain Dubber was just 19 years old at the time of his death. In 1923, Middlemarch Women's Institute donated $1,000 for a ward to be named the Captain Roy Dubber Ward at the St. Thomas Memorial Hospital. With us today, representing the family of Captain Roy Edward Dubber, are daughters of Roy's niece, Margaret Dubber Medlin, his great-nieces, Sharon Medlin Wilson and Elizabeth Medlin Savage, to present the wreath on behalf of the Silver Cross family.
We are joined by representatives of government, veterans, and the community for the presentation of wreaths, memorializing our war dead. On behalf of the Government of Canada, representing MP Andrew Lawton, Elgin St. Thomas, London, Riley Jones. The Province of Ontario, Barb Gagnon, on behalf of the Honourable Rob Flack, MPP for Elgin, Middlesex, London. Representing the County of Elgin, Warden Grant Jones. From the Municipality of Southwold, Deputy Mayor Justin Pennings. Representing the City of St. Thomas, Mayor Joe Preston. It's different when you do it inside. You have to figure things out. Representing 31 Combat Engineer Regiment, the Elgins, Pete Vasconcelos. Representing Southwold Veterans, on behalf of her late father, Murray Smith, Myrna Stoss. Representing the Royal Canadian Air Force, Ken Kennedy. Ken is a former RCAF pilot, and he is also presenting in honor of his late father, Wing Commander A.J. Kennedy, Base Commander of Fingal No. 4 Bombing and Gunnery School from October 1941 to May 1942. Representing Royal Canadian Navy, Jack Balutz and Bob Clark. Korea veterans, Paul Rochon and Robert McGinn. Representing No. 4 Bombing and Gunnery School Association, Brenda Longhurst. She is presenting in honor of her late father, Lawrence Spicer. Royal Canadian Legion Branch 41, our Parade Marshal, Will Alden. On behalf of Indigenous veterans, Sarah Emons. .427 Wing Air Force Association, Sam Newman. Canadian Army Veterans Motorcycle Unit, President Wally Thibodeau and Vice President Tim Duquette. This group is comprised of Canadian Army, Navy, and Air Force veterans, active forces, and associates. Southwold Fire Department, Fire Chief Jeff McArthur. Representing the Ontario Provincial Police, London Police Chief Tai Trong. Canadian Association of Veterans in United Nations Peacekeeping, William Hartsgrove. Dutch Canadian families, Ida Martin. Southwold History Committee, Karen Collard. Karen was a member of the original Southwold Veterans Research Committee. Representing Southwold Youth, Kylie Todd. Kylie is a descendant of John Bugler, a Southwold pioneer settler in Talbotville who served with the Norfolk Militia in the War of 1812. "41st Shedden Scouts, Esma and Iris Young. Warren Lodge 120, Joe Westlaken. Elgin Historical Society, Al Bod. All right, now is the time when we invite our children in attendance to participate in this morning's service by placing wooden crosses in front of the stage. So if there are any children that wish to participate, please come forward now and receive your crosses from our Silver Cross family representatives, Sharon Medlin Wilson and Elizabeth Medlin Savage. Come forward.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
I share with you the benediction. O God, we remember those who are forever young in your presence. Guide us today, tomorrow, and in our future as we continue to work for peace in our generation. Let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with each of us. And everybody said, Amen.
In Flanders field, the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky, the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago, we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe, to you from failing hands we throw. The torch be yours to hold it high, if ye break faith with us who die. We shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields. Please stand as you're able and join with vocalist Leah Morise as we pay tribute to Canada with the singing of our national anthem.
Color party. Jen, here it goes.
Oh, Canada, our home and native land, true patriot love, in all of us command. With glowing hearts we see thee rise, the true
Please be seated. This concludes our 26th annual Southwold Remembrance Day service. Our Memorial Committee sincerely thanks everyone who participated this morning. I would like to take a moment and thank my dad, Bill Arts, for his 21 years as part of this committee, as MC for this event, and for passing the torch on to me to become your MC for hopefully the next 21 years. So thank you very much, Dad. I don't have the deep voice that he has, but I'll do my best. We also want to acknowledge Deanna Cole, who applied her sewing skills to refurbish the large RCAF flag on display to my left. The flag, which reportedly flew in 1941, was donated to Southwold Remembers by our friends at the Royal Canadian Legion Branch 41 in St. Thomas. Ted Barris will be available with copies of his book, Breaking the Silence, and will be pleased to sign your copy to my right in the corner. I think I have every book that you've sold here, Ted, and I love them all. That's me. Recopy, reprint. Anyway, please join us for Remembrance Day services next year, November 8th, 2026. Parade Marshal, march off. I forgot to mention there are refreshments if you'd like to stay for a while as well. Thank you.